Great, thanks a lot. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all, especially to an international audience. I appreciate the fact that I can speak to a kind of a manager-oriented audience and not have to be apologetic about how scientists tend to use the metric system most of the time. So, as they mentioned, I'm in eastern Montana at the USDA research station, 55,000 acres, that known colloquially as Fort Keogh, doing research on fire and grazing work. But what I'm going to present here mostly is some stuff from my previous life as an academic at North Dakota State University. But first, we're going to go over rangeland ecology and the role of heterogeneity in general, and talk about heterogeneity effects on with respect to livestock production specifically, and then talk about fire and soil as well. If you've seen this, you've probably seen some of this stuff before, but I can assure you there's going to be some new stuff at the end of the talk where we talk about some social science that just came out, perception and adoption of prescribed fire, and some barriers and opportunities. And so I want to first just recognize Craig Meyer here. I've used this photo for a long time. Craig was our coordinator over at the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium here at our hands-on fire science workshop in Missouri is the briefing pictured here. Sadly, Craig passed at the end of last year, and I just want to can't take the photo out, and right now I can't move past it. So just recognize Craig there. So when we talk about the heterogeneity, we begin with thinking about the pre-European, pre-colonial landscape. A term that's been coined is pyrrhic herbivory, which is the interaction of fire and grazing. Each of these are disturbances in their own right, but when fire precedes grazing, and we have this shifting mosaic on the landscape, we kind of think of that as a unique disturbance. So the general pattern with this is that recent burns have this high quality forage. It attracts herbivores, particularly grazers, to that area. They concentrate their grazing there. And just as importantly, they ignore other parts of the landscape. So these areas grow up, and we have the structural heterogeneity at that landscape scale. Now, this is probably old hat to a lot of people who are thinking about prescribed fire, but this is a really core concept to the whole idea of patch burn grazing that it bears repeating. So in here, what we're trying to depict in this image is the pre-European landscape where these fires were generally the very dynamic in terms of their extent and their frequency, mostly driven by features on the landscape, which obviously in a more of a management situation, we're defining that, but we'll get into that shortly. So as a member of the Engeldorf, the Sam Fullendorf, Dave Engel school, we're contractually obligated to show this graph anytime we're talking about this stuff. And you can see that time since fire gradient along the x-axis, and you see how the vegetation becomes more dense as it grows up. And you can see that there are these specific suites of birds, or at least species of birds, that tend towards some of these habitat types specifically, such that if that habitat type wasn't there, you wouldn't have, say, killdeer or habitat for Henslow sparrow. Slightly more colorful is this image with some bird photos from Tori Hovick that we had in our in a recent textbook on fire, and you can see how that same gradient there appeals to different suites of birds. So this fire gradient that we create is habitat gradient. When we're thinking about restoration of this heterogeneity through patch burn grazing, what we are really talking about is applied landscape ecology. So we are imposing a pattern, trying to restore a pattern of disturbance, so prescribed fires, throw some cattle out there, and by having those animals, those foraging animals, targeting those burned areas, ignoring the other areas, we restore some of the ecological processes that lead to productive and biodiverse rangelands. So the patch burning is essentially just the management, operationalization of the pyrrhic herbivory concept. And now most of the work that's been done on this so far is focused on biodiversity conservation. So bringing in grazing to conservation areas that have had grazing excluded. And I'm kind of referring to that as patchburn grazing 1.0. That stuff started by Devan Allen and Sam, and kind of the first paper on that was like 2000. And you can think about this work still continuing from the early 2000s. So I see that there are potential benefits, though, of prescribed fire for livestock production in terms of improving the forage quality, improving livestock performance, and enhancing nutrient cycling. So as I address what I call patchburn grazing 2.0, these two grad students pictured here are key players in this. I'm using their work. A lot on the top is Megan Wanchuk, and below is Jonathan Spees. A little more on them in a bit. So we'll go back over this with the patchburn grazing 1.0. All the research on that is really focused on wildlife and creating habitat diversity, structural gradients, or maybe using fire to control woody invaders. And though it depends on grazing, and it's often used, they're often using cattle, domestic livestock, they're not really considering this research hasn't really considered how those cattle have fared in this system beyond basically the cattle performance won't decline, as in this is a means that we can use to get producers to either volunteer or work with conservation areas to get their production herds onto that conservation area following the patch burning. And they say, like, hey, let us use your grazers for a season. And they won't die. Is essentially what we're telling producers, so that we can get those animals over there. And that was this last point here is essentially the title of a paper, like gains don't decline if you have animals on patchburn grazing. Now, so a lot of that patchburn grazing 1.0 work, thinking about how it relates back to the pure herbivory concept in commercial and modern working rangelands, led to this chapter development here. If you haven't seen this, this is kind of where the go-to citation for the role of heterogeneity in rangeland management. This chapter 5 out of Brisky's book, and in there we differentiate or use literature to support the differentiation between two types of heterogeneity. So the first we're going to think about is being inherent heterogeneity. And by these, I mean these are the sources of heterogeneity on the landscape. Inherent heterogeneity is essentially, you can think about it as bottom up. This is environmental variability that just occurs naturally on the landscape. So we're thinking about what's driven by parent material, topographic things, and moisture gradients. We see this and access it mostly as soil types on a soil map. And then rangeland ecologists have gone beyond that to develop these ecological sites and ecological site descriptions. So what I have on the left here is a map of the ecological sites on 4 of our pastures, from which I will be presenting data here. And if you see that yellow squiggle there, we can see in this drone image on the side that yellow squiggle is that thin clay, that's down in a saline lowland. You can see the saltiness in the white there. It's low, it's wet almost all year long, every year. And that's just going to be the case that area is green and highly productive. So these things are just generally fixed in time and space. Soils, slopes don't change much on a management timeline, as opposed to this top-down disturbance-driven heterogeneity, where it can be dynamic. We can have a shifting mosaic of fire in the landscape. So here is a pretty good image of how we're imposing fire. You see the smoke coming together. We're burning this little patch. If you look in the back of this picture, to the left, you can see a previously burned patch that was done either earlier that day or the day before. So we're putting this heterogeneity onto the landscape through our management. And the way I think about how these two interact is the squares versus the squiggles. Now, the squiggles, of course, they're just a natural occurring variability due to soils. You can see that in the soil map. There's these gray lines here. And the squares are imposed boundaries of our prescribed fires. And obviously, this is just from our first 2 years of fire, the 2017 and the 2018. But why I like this one is if you were to look in the lower right-hand corner, this gap here, around here, is in fact this fire. And you can see this low marshy area here. That's considerable heterogeneity between some of the, this is on the Missouri Coteau, so it's very variable in terms of having thin hillsides, hilltops, and then these wet and very loamy bottoms. So the premise here is going back to the dynamics we see in the pre-colonial landscape. That heterogeneous landscape is going to be able to buffer against variability here in production of grass, which is the core element of a ranching system, is it needs grass to feed livestock. And variability in that, it creates a lot of uncertainty and potentially economic risk for a producer. So with heterogeneity, the flip side of variability is stability. Heterogeneity can increase stability, which gives a producer greater predictability in making their stocking decisions. So just at a very basic level, when stocking decisions in May, how many animals are going to turn out where, what's our rotation and pasture rotation going to be, a heterogeneous landscape is likely to just provide some certainty in that those animals are going to have the forage they require later in the season. There's no crystal ball, but you can put yourself in a better position to have reliable stocking and reliable grazing for the stocking. And we think we can get that through heterogeneity. And on the end of this, it's a series of marginal benefits, but in sum, there's the potential for having less reliance on purchased inputs. Now, in rangelands or extensive livestock production systems, we're looking at minimizing the cost per production unit, which is the cow or the steer. So reducing purchased inputs is really important for the financial sustainability of a ranching operation. So we have some evidence of this from Patch-burn Grazing 1.0. Like I said, none of those studies had really been set up to test this or discuss this, but what I was able to do is use some of those data, graphed here, to show that as spatial heterogeneity increases, we do reduce temporal variability. We have that reliability in the landscape in terms of here standing crop, available vegetation. So that's essentially a grass bank. And we think about saving paddocks, if you had fenced areas, or saving a pasture, deferring grazing, so that if there is a drought, you can release animals in there and they can graze. And I'm saying that basically the landscape provides that. A heterogeneous landscape provides that by having these unburned areas that haven't been burned for a while. Animals aren't grazing there. They're ignoring them. They're growing up. That's essentially a grass bank is the premise here. And I'm going to return to that here in a second. So thinking about fire for livestock production, the just straight up question here is prescribed fire, does it potentially have some direct benefits for the rancher? And we're focused here on the Northern Great Plains. And with this image here, you also see that a novel component of some of this is we're studying sheep. There hasn't been a lot of any patch-burn grazing research from 1.0 or otherwise that I've been familiar with, but we did a direct comparison of cattle and sheep as well. So I'll touch on some of that. So here are our study sites. You can see we're up in North Dakota. We're in the central grasslands region. I have the major land resource areas here plotted. So you see that's Mesa, that Streeter, that central grasslands is mostly in the central prairie coteau, Missouri coteau. And then west of the river, as the North Dakotans say, we have Hettinger out there in kind of a semi-arid area. So we have these two studies here in the central grasslands. This is Megan Wanchuk's master's degree. So this is comparing grazing systems. So we have three grazing systems, which is the patch-burn grazing. We have a continuous grazing where we just put the cattle out there, no fire, but no fences. And then we have a rotational grazing system where we're moving them through paddocks. Out in Hettinger, again, as I said, we have the direct comparison of cattle and sheep. You see some more details about these. So one thing about this is thinking about the collaborative audience we have here between Canada and the Great Plains. Megan is Canadian. She is from northern Alberta or British Columbia, kind of up there where they all come together, essentially from a boreal ranch. Jonathan is from eastern Texas. So clear on the other end of we really have the scope of this audience compared here. And what was great is when they came, then essentially what's in the middle. And very rarely do we talk about North Dakota as being in the middle of a north-south gradient, but they were both working in North Dakota, and Jonathan, coming from eastern Texas was just loved how dry it was, and Megan, coming from from essentially northern Canada, was complaining about how humid it was. So it was an interesting dynamic to have in the lab. So here's what we're working on. Here's the basic layout of a pasture. So we have 160 acres of a pasture. You can see this is a full section that's split into 4 experimental pastures. And it's kind of cool when you can see what you've been up to from space. So this is just a Google Earth image of our first prescribed burn. And zooming in on that, on the flip side of seeing what you're doing from space, you can also see some of your mistakes from space. So you can see a little bit of a slop over here. But you can see that this is the burned area with the nice green forage and detraction. And these white squares represent our sampling, which were distributed around there by patches and by ecological sites. And that's going to become important later when we can talk about making a direct comparison of disturbance versus inherent heterogeneity. So here we have some images of kind of our sampling. We did monthly sampling. This is something that's new to this literature. The intensity of the sampling, basically, there hasn't been a lot of repeated sampling on this. Brady Allred has one paper. Otherwise, kind of people go out and clip something and say like, well, here's where it was this period versus that period, kind of an instantaneous. So then in the spirit of getting as much information from those data as we can, we collaborated with Marisol Birdie at North Dakota State University to do near-infrared spectroscopy analysis. So instead of sending all these samples off for wet chemistry at $25 a pop, we were able to get this full spectrum of forage quality just by zapping some light on it and doing a lot of fancy mathematics. So we're focused right now on forage, livestock production, and extensive grazing systems here. So this is really the meat of the work. This is from Megan's research. You can see our 5 sampling periods there along the x-axis, and we're presenting 6 different measures of forage quality. And what I really want you to focus on is this dark green square, and how in these measures that we generally want to see high for forage quality or forage nutritive value because we don't have an intake component measured here. Crude protein consistently higher than everything else, whether it's other patches in those landscapes or whether it's the other 2 grazing practices. Net energy remains very high season long. Lignin and fiber, these structural components have a lower digestibility. You can see are lowest in the most recently burned patch. And these data are for 4 years combined. So there was a drought year at the beginning, and then, just regular variability, but these are the patterns that are represented across all 4 years. So that was a pretty consistent impact of that recently burned patch. What we're showing here is selectivity by the grazers, by the cattle, cow-calf pairs in this case, for the different patches. Now on the left, that's all in the patch burn pastures, and patch makes sense here because we've imposed those patches to our prescribed fire, and you can see that the most recently burned patch, again, that dark green square, that is consistently higher than everything else. It's consistently above 1, which is the threshold for selection. So from May to September in all 4 years, cattle were preferring to graze in the most recently burned patch. If you look to the right there, this is exactly as we expected. These patches don't exist on the landscape. They're they're continuous grazing, they're just wandering around out there. So the patches are just kind of artificially delineated in GIS. And the rotational system, obviously, they're being pushed by a fence. So we see what we expect there is like no selection. What I really want to point out, something that I dared to want to see, I guess, is evidence of that grass bank. Notice in July, the shift between this lighter green square, which is the previous year's burned patch. And from July, I mean, look, in June and July, they're ignoring it more as much as stuff that hasn't been burned. They're ignoring that area that had been burned in the previous year. But then all of a sudden, in August and September, they're switching back to that, reducing their grazing in that most recently burned patch, burned in the spring. So it's gone. It's probably burned in April or early May. So it's gone May, June, July, starting to get dry in July, August, and we see them shifting away from that patch to the previously burned patch. And they're doing that themselves. So I see that kind of evidence of that grass bank. But instead of having to fence them off that, you see them ignoring it in June and July. And then you see them going there in August and September. And the animals are doing that by themselves. So there's no timing of rotations or monitoring or whatever. The animals just know to go over there when they need it. So we have similar trends for sheep out there in Hettinger and Jonathan's work as well. Not showing that here. So why are the animals spending all that time in there? And so one thing I really appreciate about Megan, coming from a ranch, she has a really good mind for the animal science portion of rangeland management. So she went and did two things here, where she went into the literature and found what the nutritional requirements for a lactating cow are at these 5 different points in the season. And then she looked, and because we had those multiple quadrats, you remember, multiple sampling points per patch, she was able to look at what proportion of the sampling points met a cow's nutritional requirements. So basically, what's the probability that when a cow puts her face down in the pasture, she's going to be able to eat and get what she needs nutritionally? And you can see that the most recently burned patches definitely providing the most opportunity. Now, this is an extensive rangeland system, so it's averaging about 50%, which isn't great. But if you can look and see where unburned parts of the landscape are below 10%, below 12% for sure for most of the year, and even our rotational grazing is not breaking much above 25%. So there's a 1 in 4 chance in a rotational grazing system that a cow is going to get her nutritional requirements when she puts her head down. And there's a 50% chance on average so twice that a cow in a recently burned patch is able to put her head down and get the nutrition that she needs. Megan was also interested in minerals, so she did some analysis on this, sent these off, and again, having that animal science background or interest, these lines that go across here horizontally are nutritional requirements either for the season or for early season. It's kind of the minerals do different things for animals at different times. So you can look it up, this journal article here to see exactly what she's talking about, but basically anything that is above that line is providing what the animal needs. And you can see pretty much consistently that the dark green, the most recently burned patch is either meeting the animal's needs or is higher than every other patch on the landscape, or both. So zinc is a good example. Potassium is a good example. Calcium. We're really seeing that mineral increase due to fire. So that all comes together in showing animals that are putting on weight. We had the only animals, again, these data summarize 4 years of the experiment. The patch animals coming from the patch burned areas, the pastures that had prescribed fire, were the only ones that were putting on significantly more weight across these 4 years. Rotational and continuous were no different from zero, so they're basically maintaining. I did another analysis, worked with Megan to do another analysis that had now just been accepted and is coming out, where we looked at what drove variability in either calf weights or cow weights, and Megan had the idea to break it down by dam age, so the cow ages and where animals were coming from, because we were thinking in these terms about the financial sustainability of a cow-calf operation. Southern Plains, a lot of the work on cattle that have been from patch burning has focused on stockers. You're just buying some young animals, putting them out, grazing them. Hopefully they're gaining weight, you bring them off and selling them. Cows are a little different in that you have a long-term investment cows aren't really putting off their best calves until their third or fifth year. And then you want to keep that cow, you've invested in that cow, you want to keep her going for as long as you can. And we found that rotational grazing had the lowest maternal productivity. So under the rotational grazing, we weren't getting that long-term production out of the cows. And when you couple this with the forage quality data we were showing, there's a suggestion that older cows benefit the most from the patch burning, and so there is a strong potential argument for better livestock productivity over the long term and return on investment on individual cows. So just to go back to that idea of squares versus the squiggles, because we set these set these sites up to where we nested the sampling points, these white squares within not just the patches, but within the ecological sites in there. That's the ecological sites is the source of the inherent variability. And then we impose disturbance in these squares. You can see with the broken lines there, obviously in the continuous grazing or the no fire treatment here, that doesn't exist. That's just delineated by GIS, as I mentioned, but those are actually fire breaks in the patch burned areas. And so we saw this full on switch where in the unburned, in the pastures without any fire, the ecological sites, actually inherent variability drove how much biomass there was. So these soil types, these ecological sites over here had more production than these over here. And then when we started doing the patch burning, that completely switched to where our disturbance was driving the variability in standing crop. And we saw the grazers respond. Without the fire, they just kind of wander around. You can see there's no difference there between where they're grazing, because there's nothing really driving them. And then under the patch burned ones, you really see them responding and preferring the patches over ecological sites. So they were able to get kind of one of the things that people want to get out of rotational grazing is they want to overcome this spatial preference. Cattle, and Megan showed this in her paper as well, that the grazing hotspots, as we're calling them, where cattle focus their grazing, don't change in space and time without the fire. So in the continuous grazing, cattle are going to the same spots and grazing preferentially year after year after year. And that is something that people have invented grazing management and rotational grazing to try to overcome, is to force them to move around and give up areas and go to areas that they wouldn't otherwise. We're getting that with fire, and we're getting all of the ecosystem benefits as well that we don't see with rotational grazing. So as an example of some of those ecosystem benefits, I'm going to move on to talking about fire and soil here. So we generally saw that plant available nitrogen increased after prescribed fire. We have two species of nitrogen here. Both of these are minerals that are created with heat that's applied to just regular nitrogen in the soil. We see exactly the nitrogen cycle here. We see this spike in ammonium one day after the fire that declines pretty quickly, followed by this increase in nitrate, which is just a little more stable. And so that's soil microbes responding to that input of ammonium and just doing the microbial thing to soil nitrogen and increasing nitrate. So this is a fall burn, so that in 7 months is going into the next grazing season. Looking also at the soil microbes, we mentioned them, pretty resilient to fire. You see these declines one day after the fire. You have some heating. These soil microbes, their abundance declines across all groups here that we're showing. But then within a week, they're no different than unburned areas and from the pre-burn. So definitely, so even in the fall, this is like these data were from October. Even in the fall, we're getting recovery of the microbial communities within a week. So pretty resilient there. And why is that? Well, it's mostly because even though we're burning this stuff, the heat really doesn't affect much of the below ground ecosystem. So you can see here some thermocouple data here at the soil depth of 0 centimeters. This is soil surface. We've got a thermocouple laying on the soil surface. We have just below 200 degrees Celsius, ranging up to above 400 degrees Celsius. So for those that aren't using the metric system very often, 100 degrees Celsius is boiling. So we're almost, twice boiling and almost 4 times boiling. Huge range of variability on the surface. But when you get 1 centimeter, you get 2 centimeters below. And these are modeled data here from a soil heating model to judge the heat penetration. Regardless of that surface variability, it's very low. It's at 100 degrees Celsius or below and declining quickly. So that's because soil is a really good insulator for the heat that is there. And grassy fuels just don't support a lot of heating. Yeah, you have high temperatures, but heat rises, grass burns up quickly, and there isn't that residence time to really hold heat, and that it requires to overcome that insulator effect of soil and have that heat penetrate down into the soil where the microbes and the buds and roots of plants are. Jonathan has some data. Unfortunately, these are still held up in the review process, but he was working in these former crop fields. So they were cropped until the 80s and entered into the Conservation Reserve Program, which means that the disturbance was pretty much ceased for at least 10 years, and they're seeded to perennial grasses from the crops. These areas on the far right, these are what we're calling not yet burned. We intend for them to be burned within the 4-year fire return or the 4-year patch burning cycle. After they were dropped from the CRP contract, they were grazed for years and years. And then we came in and burned them, and you can see the effect of fire, especially on total nitrogen, but also on carbon. We're substantially increasing the amount of these nutrients. So getting that the nutrient cycling going again. Jonathan also looked at soil microbes and kind of this long-term effect, and look at just how low the abundance of soil microbes are in that area, in the areas that haven't been burned. Now these are under grass, they've been grazed. But we put fire in there and we really see this uptick in soil microbes. And these are a focus of people talking about soil health. Soil health has a lot of management, carbon credit sort of funding. These are the sort of things that people are using to assess soil health, the soil microbial abundance. And we're really kicking that into gear with this prescribed fire. So the analogy I use for this and thinking about CRP is essentially it's an ecological coma. Like we have this problem with in terms of the soil ecosystem with row cropping. We're supporting productivity through artificial petroleum-based inputs. We cease that. We turn it over to perennial grasses, and essentially we're just holding that in a coma, like preventing further decline. And fire comes in, wakes up that dormant soil ecology, and then that's really the restoration of these processes I was talking about through the imposition of our management disturbance patterns. So to shift now to a bit, we want to talk some about the social science, because everybody's like, well, if these are all so great, why aren't people burning? And there's a lot of social science around that throughout the plains, throughout the world. Have several known barriers to landowners using prescribed fire. These are the 4 categories that we've lumped those into in some work that was done in my lab. We can think about the social dynamics of going out and burning in a culture, a community that doesn't really have a culture of fire. Then with that, then is the knowledge, like, well, why are we burning? And then it's kind of how do we pull this off, especially to do it safely. And then to pull it off, you need specialized, semi-specialized equipment and crews, especially when you think about what a farmer or a rancher is generally doing. And then they're always doing that within a regulatory framework that can shift throughout the year, and then from different states, provinces, countries, all that stuff. So we were essentially commissioned by the Forest Service to do a survey of users, grazers of the public rangeland. So as you know, we have a lot of public land in the United States. A lot of it's in the West, but in the East and North Dakota and South Dakota, we do have these 4 national grassland units. So they're owned by the owned and managed by the Forest Service. You have these producers, cattle producers, who have permits to take their cattle onto those areas for essentially the grazing season and graze them. But then they bring them home. So they have to have a home ranch. So people can't just be buying cows, dumping them on the grasslands and hoping that they can sell them again. They have to have a home ranch. So what we were thinking with this is by targeting these producers who do a lot of their grazing on public land, we're kind of controlling for some of these barriers because the Forest Service would have to take on doing the prescribed fire. So they have the knowledge, they have the equipment, they have the regulatory frameworks to get a burn plan together, and it's federal land. So a lot of these things that people say are barriers to prescribed fire kind of go away if a federal agency is doing it essentially for them. And so we thought that might be an interesting community to see what they thought about prescribed fire. If we could say, like, some of these barriers, you don't have to worry about. So now what do you think about burning? And they generally were quite against prescribed fire. So showing here just a couple results from this paper that just came out just a few weeks ago. You can see kind of in here, I would summarize this as a lack of awareness of some of the science that I have just presented to you, and that we have these landowners and grazers, the ranchers, want to see the grasslands managed according to the best available science. And not to toot my own horn, but I think I showed you some of the best available science, and it just points to the benefits of prescribed fire. But you can see here on the other side, they really don't want to see any more prescribed fire on their grasslands. Here are some of their own perceptions about first their community on the top, and then their own personal beliefs about fire. You can see that the standard things, they believe that there's risk to property, human safety. See, they don't really care about smoke. Interestingly, they're not in all that concerned about soil erosion or wildlife, but they see that loss of forage and potential loss to property and harm as their main reservations about prescribed fire. As you can see here, they're not ready to burn. They're not ready to use it. And they don't think others should really be able to use it either. If you look at these lower ones, these lower data points that are significantly different than zero, they're significantly negative, they don't think people should burn as much as they want. And they definitely aren't ready to burn. So what do we think about that in terms of this framework that we put together in my lab? Again, you can see these four categories of barriers: social, knowledge, practical, and regulation, that someone has to get through if they're a potential burner thinking about prescribed fire and then actually getting to where they use prescribed fire. And this is a interesting paper. If you haven't seen this, it just really it's a review paper that summarizes everything from the Great Plains in terms of what those barriers are and gives citations for all these in the paper. But these North Dakotans and the South Dakotans that we surveyed anywhere are really stuck down in this bottom corner where they are concerned. They have negative personal attitudes, they have negative community attitudes, and they don't understand why we should be applying fire. And so among the fire community, a common tool that we believe might increase prescribed fire adoption is creating and recruiting members to prescribed burn associations. Also, us in the Northern Plains look to the Southern Plains, where there are these vibrant, I'd say, certainly active prescribed fire cultures. And one of the main ways that private landowners get fire done is through participation in prescribed burn associations. So those of us familiar with that culture, with that system, and the potential benefits there, kind of think, well, we should have some PPAs in the Northern Plains, and that'll get us around this lack of burning. We just need these PBAs. And as an Iowan, I'm a big fan of the phrase, if you build it, they will come. And unfortunately, in this case, I just don't think that is the case, because while being a member of a PBA can kind of expose people to the pro-fire stuff, help with that negative, help overcome a negative attitude, and there can have some knowledge sharing. PBAs really address the practical and the regulation aspects of barriers. And most of the people that we surveyed seem to be well before that and what would be called the pre-contemplation phase. So having PBAs is probably not going to get a lot more fire on the ground in the northern plains is kind of where I'm looking at that. So if we want people to be thinking about prescribed burning more, what do we want to be doing? And I think that it comes from building familiarity with fire, and for ranchers specifically, building that familiarity with the forage and the benefits that come from fire. And how do we do that, especially in these areas with a lot of public land, where I'm at in eastern Montana, anywhere west here, there's a lot of public land grazing. But then these folks in North Dakota, including eastern North Dakota and Cheyenne National Grasslands, they have their wildfires out on these on their allotments. And the current practice or policy, it kind of depends on whether you're Forest Service or BLM or what district you're in. But generally, at least where they start, is that grazing will be deferred for 2 years. And that can be absolutely no grazing for 2 years. That could be lower stocking rates. That could be a later turnout. But whatever, they're modifying grazing plans for about 2 years. I did analysis of the allotments on the national grasslands, and I found no evidence. And I got like the rental or the permit records, found no evidence of any grazing on the national grasslands within 2 years of a wildfire. And to me, that's just kind of shocking, because as you see, my research shows that get animals out on burned areas. That's when the best grazing is. So we're sitting back and saying, oh, we can't graze that, and just letting forage go to waste, honestly, is what I think we're doing with that. And so I think that if we're able to get cattle out there on these burned allotments, burned by wildfires, and people start to see what the benefits are, and they aren't going to have, they're not going to destroy that rangeland. I think one of the main questions, and I'm very sympathetic to this, is that, somebody could say to me, it's like, yeah, you're studying prescribed fires, right? You've done this under a prescription. It's not going to be too windy. It's not going to be too dry. Otherwise, you couldn't do it. So you're showing us this moderate fire behavior. And these are wildfires that are driven by wind. They're potentially they occur during red flag. The times when you're told not to even grill a hot dog, that's when these fires occur. So they're potentially more severe. But I go back to that modeling that we showed, and talking about grasslands is like, soil is a really good insulator, and these fuels we have just don't hold heat for very long. So I started looking around, and this is, I'm going to do more on this, but I went to, all those, so I went to all the experimental stuff I showed you, this patch burning without grazing. Those were the soil heating things with the short-term responses of microbes and plant available nitrogen, where we saw that recovery in either a week or 7 months. And then the prescribed fire with moderate grazing, just to keep it local, that's Hettinger. That's all the Hettinger stuff that Jonathan's data are. And then this escape was intended to be a prescribed fire. It turned into be a wildfire just on the other side of the fence. So it's kind of like, well, that was intended fire behavior. It just wasn't where we wanted it to be. And then I looked at several wildfires in around Miles City, east of Miles City, between here and Hettinger, that I was familiar with. A couple of them I responded to, so I saw the fire behavior and saw that, familiar with that, but either the fire behavior the day of, or we were working on some measurements and seeing some of the effects. And the measurement here that I'm showing you is severity. I'm not going to get into it right here, but this is a satellite-based thing where you look at an image that the satellite took right before the fire, and then you look at an image that the satellite took right after the fire, and you look at hyperspectral stuff, so it's beyond what you see with the naked eye. But anyway, that comparison of those two images gives you a degree of removal, like how much stuff from the surface was removed. And you can see there's a huge amount of variability in every one of these types types of fire. And even where we've had some moderate grazing when we're burning under prescription, we're getting considerably higher severity than in straight up wildfires. And these X's, these outliers on the wildfire severity there, that was in a fire that had a lot of juniper and ponderosa pine in there. So we're getting some coarse fuels that are burning and holding that heat, getting that residence time, and it's still up there with what we're able to get with that. And again, that prescribed patch burn, no grazing, those are the ones where I was showing you that microbial recovery and the elevated soil nutrients. So, which we'd say, like, oh, those are great responses, and those are outliers for a wildfire. And I think this is mostly because wildfires are usually wind-driven. We're looking mostly at wind-driven head fires that move through these areas pretty quickly, whereas a lot of our prescribed fires, because they're under moderate conditions, we've tried to mitigate that by doing a lot of strip burning and a lot of backing fires. Anyway, that's and then some fire-specific stuff that I do like to talk about, but we're running out of time. So to bring this all together, I see some direct benefits for livestock production from prescribed burning. Just to put it as simply as we can, burn patches, have better forage, and the livestock like it. They go there and they eat it and they do better there. We see these positive or neutral effects on soil nutrients, plant available nitrogen, and soil microbes. I'd argue that disturbance is essential for the conservation of our grassland ecosystems, and we're not going to get people who don't like fire to use prescribed fire, I don't think, until they become directly familiar with those benefits. Just being told about it and encouraged to burn does not seem to be working here. So we need to get them out, have them graze some burned areas. And then I think we can kind of move the needle on that, as they say. So anyway, that's what I have to show you, some kind of older stuff that we've been presenting, some new stuff that's coming out. And we have enough time or whatever, I'd love to take some questions. Thanks a lot.
Amazing, Devan. Thank you so much. Lori, do we have any questions?
We do. We actually have a couple of them. So the first one is asking if you've done soil heating studies from below different fuel types, like shrubby versus grassy, and wants to know the soil about soil microbes below things like creeping juniper and in sandy sites. So a bunch of things, different soil types below certain forage as well.
Yeah. So why I compared the patch burns without grazing versus grazing is that we saw when we were burning that there was a lot more fuel in those areas that hadn't been grazed. So that we would have just expected to see much higher intensity there because the fuel load was higher. We didn't see that. We have not, well, I don't have it here yet. We are doing some sagebrush fire ecology work here on the fort with both silver sage and Wyoming big sage, and we are comparing fire behavior outside in the grass, like kind of an open grassland patch versus right under the sagebrush plants. So we have focal plants and we have kind of designated grassy areas. So we have thermocouples there. We unfortunately don't have the funding right now to do soil microbial analysis on those, but as that project goes forward, that would be a good opportunity to collect those data specifically. I don't know if there's other components of that question that I might address.
Nope, that was kind of the whole, that was good enough. That was good enough. Another one that came in says you discussed patch burn in this presentation, but could you comment on if the whole pasture burns? Would you recommend one grazing season or rest? I think it says of rest, or would you recommend setting the cattle out to pasture that year at a reduced stocking rate?
If the entire pasture burns?
That's what it says, if the whole pasture burns, yeah.
Well, then you got to increase your stocking rate to get this. So that's what I love hearing people, and I've heard people say like, well, we tried patch burn grazing, but it didn't work. And I love that because I was just like, okay, why? Because everything's on a gradient, and so what? There's okay, what does not work? That's pretty bimodal. What I hear people saying is that they're like, oh well, you have to stock the pasture for the grazed for the burned patch. So if you're burning a fourth, people are reducing their stocking rate down to 25% of the pasture's carrying capacity. And so what they don't get is the pyrrhic herbivory. Like you need the fire and then you need the grazing. It needs to happen on the burned area. The animals have to go there. They have to eat it. That's why we have, even in our drought year, no rain after cattle turnout. We still had higher crude protein on burned areas. And that's because the animals were grazing it. The grass did not get to grow up. It did not get to put on a seed head. It did not get mature. It did not get stemmy. It did not get fibrous. And if the stocking rate were relaxed, the grass would essentially grow up in front of the animals, and that contrast and quality would be lost. So if an entire pasture were to be burned, I would treat that as a big patch, and that I would stock it in that year and then give it 3 to 4 years rest as if it were a patch. But the quality benefits will not persist, or again, unlikely to persist through the season unless that stocking rate, I would argue, is quadruple to maintain that pasture-wide pressure. Anything else?
Follow up, I believe. It said, this comes again from Brendan. It says, thanks for your response. Mostly I'm thinking about the fact that there is reduced available forage after fire. Do you think an increase in protein content replaces a loss in forage?
Yes, and it's not really a loss of forage. I've seen this presented from some colleagues in South Dakota where they had the total available and they just went out and clipped one time. Here's the amount of grass standing in the burn patch. Here's the amount of grass standing in the unburned patch, and it's a third lower, across these pastures. And so like, whoa, but that grass is still growing. Part of maintaining it in its immature state is that it's still growing. I think of it as growing into the cow's mouth. So yeah, they go, there's maybe the leaf is there's only 2 or 3 leaves on the grass plant and they bite it off, but it regrows. And there's been some work on rotational grazing. I think of some stuff from the CARM study down in Cheyenne ARS, where they actually, they went and they put like white paint on bitten tillers to see how often and they, even in a rotational grazing system, only 1/3 of the tillers are bitten at a time. And so even though, yes, there is this constant grazing, plants do get the chance to regrow. And so as long as there is rain, but again, we did this in a drought and it still came up. So I think there's some plant composition specific stuff, some ecosystem specific stuff. But in general, on an average year, I would expect that you generally just have grass growing into their mouth. So you look out there, it looks like it's low forage, but it's producing. Think about mowing your lawn. If you mow your lawn like you're supposed to, so the town doesn't get mad at you and cite you, you have to mow it every so often. Think of if you piled all those clippings into a pile versus just mowing it at the end of the year. That pile from every time you mowed it, that pile is going to be a lot larger than your end of the year. So any one time you went out and mowed, there wasn't very much, but it accumulates. And that bagger on your mower is essentially what the cow's rumen is in this case. As long as you have the rain, as long as you have the production. I understand that there are cases and systems where that might not be the case. But anyway, so thanks for that. I like to talk about that because that's an unseen dynamic that is part of the pyrrhic herbivory thing that just might not be intuitive, especially people that have been brought up or exposed or following some of the more traditional range and pasture management philosophy. Very ecological.
And this last one in chat is a follow-up from something you said at SRM meeting. So it said that you had shared a little bit about the NERD prescribed fire treks
Yeah.
That's a quote. And they would like just to share with the whole group a little bit more about that, and they're going to catch it in the recording since they had to run to go teach.
Right on. Oh yeah, okay. I know that is one of Megan's friends. Yes. So I didn't plant this really, but we do. And by we, it's a large group of scientists and the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, sponsored by the Tallgrass Prairie Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. At Dunrance Prairie, a TNC property in northern Missouri, we do a week-long hands-on fire science workshop. We call it nerd treks because people are becoming increasingly familiar with the prescribed fire training and experience exchanges. They're all over the country. They're all over the continent. I think they're all getting to be all over the world now. Some of them are indigenous focused and da-da-da. That's a great model. People go there often with open task books or just wanting to get experience on the fire line. Ours is specifically aimed at early career students, researchers, managers, whatever, to try to get more integration with fire science and management. So we want scientists to understand the logistics of doing prescribed fire and basically to not come up with these ridiculous study designs that an ignition specialist looks at and like, oh my God, how are we going to pull that off? And then also managers can see what scientists are doing and how they can better inform some of their objectives in writing a burn plan and ideally even making a no-go decision based on objectives. And we expose people how to measure fuels, fine fuel, moisture content, live, dead. We have thermocouples out there measuring rate of spread, not just heating. And it's a week-long thing. Ours is coming up in a couple of weeks, so it's too late to do it this year, but it's always in like that first part of April. And keep an eye out on the Fire Science Exchanges. We hope to keep it going. This is our 4th year doing it, and it's just a lot of fun. And yeah, so yeah, that's my pitch for that. Thank you for that opportunity.